Hi everyone, we're so excited to see you. I'm really delighted actually to be able to meet at least in this way, if not in the way that we had originally intended. Welcome to Graduate Education for the Public Good. My name is Katina Rogers. I work at CUNY Graduate Center as co-director of the Futures Initiative, the CUNY Humanities Alliance, and HASTAC. I want to thank Adashima Oyo, who's the director of HASTAC Scholars, who's been spearheading and managing the Digital Fridays series and agreed to let us run this online conversation as part of that series when it no longer was possible for us to meet together in person. And I'm joined in speaking today by Stacy Hartman, who's director of the Publics Lab, Cihan Tekay, who's a doctoral candidate in anthropology and a Futures Initiative graduate fellow, and Justin Beauchamp, doctoral student in sociology, who also works on programming and administration for the Publics Lab. I want to start by acknowledging the complexity of the current moment that we're all in. I'm glad that people have been able to take the time to join us from whatever situation you may be beaming in from. I know that this is upending all kinds of plans, including the conference that we were really looking forward to hosting today, Graduate Education at Work in the World. We're just really appreciative that you joined us today, and we hope that you and your loved ones are well. I also want to acknowledge my own feelings of disappointment that we're not all in the same room. This isn't what we had planned for today, but here we are, and we're really glad to have the opportunity to connect. So I want to just give a little bit of framing to tell you a bit more about how today's session came about, and then I'll let each person introduce themselves at a little bit more length, and then we'll get into the discussion, and there will be time for Q&A with everybody who's participating. Oh, also, if someone wouldn't mind dropping the public notes document into the chat, that way everyone will have our bios and the relevant links ready at hand. So the conference that we were planning, Graduate Education at Work in the World, emerged as a collaboration between the Futures Initiative and the Publics Lab as a way to examine the nature, the value, and the structure of graduate education. Not only the way that it is now, but the way that we might imagine it to be. I've been thinking a lot about the future of higher ed lately, and while I know that things are extremely difficult now, maybe more than ever, I also want to find ways to focus on the possibility of joy and sustainability. At the same time, I don't think that you can talk about joy without acknowledging the systems of power that are currently in place and working to bring about greater justice and equity in those systems. And I think about this especially on May Day as people reflect on labor structures around the world and solidarity for workers' rights at a moment where we're seeing such vast inequality in how those rights are manifest and how people are able to stay safe through the pandemic. What I've been finding, and we had been thinking about this together long before all of the COVID stuff came about, but often conversations about career pathways are kind of add-ons in graduate education. They might be happening in a separate space from academic matters, or they might not take into consideration the broader landscape of institutions and structures. But I feel really strongly that unless institutions address things like the increasing reliance on adjunct labor and the ways that that increasing reliance on precarious workers undermines teaching and learning, as well as things like gender bias and racism that continue to be deeply problematic for both students and faculty. Without reflecting on and acting on those things, I think that deep and lasting change in other areas will be extremely difficult, if not impossible. So this is why we created the opportunity to have a sustained conversation, which this 1-hour session is not, but next year we hope you'll join us. A sustained conversation on the topic, one that focuses not only on skills or employability, but on how we got here institutionally and as individuals and how we move forward. I had been thinking this through, in part through the writing of my book, sorry, I'm so nervous to tell about my own book, Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, Thriving in and Beyond the Classroom, which is coming out from Duke University Press in July. I promise to shamelessly plug it. You can pre-order it from bookshop.org or from any of your favorite local bookstores. What I try to focus on in this book is the fact that career development is not a standalone issue. It's embedded in questions of equity, inclusion, evaluation, labor structures, and more. The book examines the intersections of these practical and structural matters and offers concrete recommendations for students, for faculty members, and for administrators. So I hope that it's useful, particularly in this moment. And I've become convinced in this work that one underlying stumbling block to meaningful change is a misalignment between values and structures. We have an economy of prestige on one hand, which is something I think will come up quite a bit in the conversation, versus a desire to serve the public good on the other. So I'm looking forward to teasing that out in our conversation today. I think that that's all that I will say for now, and I'll turn it over to Stacy.
Hi, everyone. So first, before I say anything else, I want to say that I had the very great honor of reading Katina, an earlier draft of Katina's book, and I'm sure it has only gotten even better. But even at the time, it was amazing. So I hope you will all pre-order it, because I know that Katina feels weird about plugging it, but I have no such qualms. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Stacy Hartman. I'm director of the Publics Lab at the Graduate Center. The mission of the Publics Lab is to support graduate students and faculty at the GC who are engaged in public scholarship. And we do this in a number of ways. We have a fellowship program for graduate students. We run in normal times, we run events and workshops on sort of the practice and methods of public scholarship. We have an internship program that we run, and we also focus on the curricular side of things through grants to departments, for departments to make changes to curriculum to better prepare their students to do public scholarship, and also to do a huge variety of things in the world. And so this is how we ended up in conversation with the Futures Initiative, and what led to the conference that we were supposed to have today. From my own background, I came to this conversation about public scholarship through talking about careers. And I'm in complete agreement with Katina about the ways in which the conversation about careers intersects with all these, careers for PhDs, I should say, intersects with all these other conversations. Because it really, when you talk about graduate education and doctoral education, you really start to get at the nitty gritty of what people believe education is for, and what people believe that higher education is for, and what, and the values that we hold, and like Katina was saying, the ways that those values are at odds with the structures that we're all embedded in. And this idea of the prestige economy is something that I've become very interested in since I came to CUNY, which is about 1.5 years now. And this, when you think about the prestige economy, what really comes up for me is the fact that it is a system based on exclusion, right? So it is the fact that the universities that are ranked the highest are the ones that exclude the most people, right? Who take the smallest number of people, and that's how we define excellence in the academy, is through exclusion. And so when you have a system that is based on exclusion as like the ultimate metric of success, it becomes very hard to think about things like inclusion and access, which are things that many of us in higher ed say that we value, but the structures, the way that we measure ourselves, the way that we measure each other, it's all based on exclusion. And so the prestige economy, which is embedded in higher ed, not only through admissions practices, but also through tenure practices, also through, the questions that people always ask each other, like, where did you get your doctorate? Where do you teach? And who published your book? Right? All of those, everything about how we think about each other and how judge each other, let's be honest, is based around the prestige economy. And so I want to quote someone who's, so last January at MLA, Katina and I organized a panel on the prestige economy. And during this panel, one of our fellow panelists, Veronica Barrera-Kolb, who is a faculty member in the humanities at Seattle City College, made the point that this is really it's about the capitalist logics, right? It's about the capitalist logics of higher education, in which prestige equates to property. And so things like research are much more highly valued than things like teaching. So I think when we think about labor, we have to also recognize the ways in which the prestige economy is at work in the logics of how we value our own labor and our own work as well. So that's some of what I'm sure that this will come up again in our conversation today, but this is something that I've been thinking a lot about for the past 18 months. The sort of the logics and the illogics of the prestige economy, and the way that it intersects and blocks or provides a roadblock to the values that many of us hold.
Hello, my name is Cihan Tekay, and I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at the Grad Center. And I've been a graduate fellow with the Futures Initiative since last fall. And as part of my role here, I've been assisting Katina with organizing the Graduate Education at Work conference, which we co-sponsored with Publics Lab, Justin and Stacy. And also I've been helping with preparing her book for the last stages of its publication. As part of my general role in the Futures Initiative, I also contribute to our team's efforts to advocate for public scholarship and engage a variety of audiences in the sciences and humanities. And my doctoral research is on the relationship between electrical technology and political economy in Turkey and Europe. And that's all I'm gonna say for now. And I use she and her pronouns if you need to refer to me. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Justin Beauchamp. All pronouns are fine for me. I'm a current first-year student in the Sociology PhD program at the Graduate Center. And I'm also a college assistant for the Publics Lab, where I assist Stacy and our faculty lead, Bianca Williams, with our various events and programs, and then some behind-the-scenes stuff like the website, social media, and other similar projects. Broadly speaking, I'm interested in the role of higher education in the public good, still in the early stages of narrowing down, more specific research interests. And that will, be determined, as I progress through my program in the coming years. So that's all I'll say for now, and I will turn it over to Katina, who I think is going to get us started on the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And I should mention I use she, her pronouns. So before we go any further, I really want to thank Cihan and Justin and Stacy for all of their work, not only in being a part of today's session, but for all of the work that went into planning the conference. Any of you who are listening have planned a conference before, it is a bear, and working with this group of people has been a total delight. I feel really lucky to have gotten to spend so much time with everyone thinking these questions through. And it's a good thing because we get to plan it again. So we'll see how that process goes, but it's been a joy. And I also want to thank everyone who's joining us today, who submitted proposals and who had planned to be with us in New York City. We're really glad that you're here. So the structure of the rest of our hour will be focusing on questions and discussion, focusing on really patterns that we saw emerging through reviewing the conference proposals, as well as other themes that we would like to discuss, themes like academic labor, public investment in teaching and in higher ed more broadly, the hidden curriculum, and the purpose and value of higher ed and the humanities. As we're discussing each question, we'll each be speaking from our own subject positions, Stacy and I speaking from our roles as administrators, Justin and Cihan from their roles as graduate students and workers within our programs. I want to acknowledge, as a white woman in an administrative position, there's many people who look like me in conversations like this, and so it's relatively easier for me to access and gain a foothold in these kinds of conversations. So we'll be talking about equity and inclusion, and that positionality factors into my view and my ideas for ways we can do things better. So Cihan is going to start by asking the first discussion question. Cihan, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, so our first question is, how does the notion of public good change in light of the current pandemic? What is our role in it as scholars? And what do you see as the purpose of the humanities and social sciences at a moment like this? In sum, why do we do what we do? So let's say we all have collectively 5 to 7 maximum minutes before we move on to the next question. So Katina, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think one of the things that has really struck me is that in talking about what's happening right now with the COVID pandemic, in talking about what the effects are likely to be, it has been very, very clear that we're not just talking about the science of a virus or of transmission, but we're talking about the social, political, and economic structures that make this a global crisis and that make the effects unevenly distributed. We're all based in and around New York City, and at CUNY, we see this really acutely. We see the differential of people who have, who have the financial security to weather this and who have the safety in their homes to be able to have a safe place to be. And we see many, many people, including many of our students, with food insecurity and housing insecurity and just so much job insecurity. And we know that those are factors that have to do with racism, with all of the persistent types of inequality that have existed in cities. And so this is not only a question of science and of medicine, but a question of humanity and of how all of these different systems intersect. There's human and emotional and relational factors that make this a mental health crisis for many. And I also have found that in many conversations, people are really looking for signs of beauty and hope within the pain and the panic. And I think that is something that is deeply important in humanistic conversations and in humanistic inquiry as well. So I think that, thinking about the role that the humanities can play and our relationship to the public in a moment like this is quite complex, but I think it's more important than ever.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think one of the things that humanists do really well is theorize power. And so thinking about the ways in which, something like COVID, it's not a blank slate, right? It exposes all of these seams that already existed in our society. And I think the humanities and the social sciences are really good at talking about those things. I think something else we're really good at is the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot in times like this. And in some ways it is. And in other ways, it's not terribly unprecedented. Orhan Pamuk had a really good piece in the New York Times this last week. He's been working on a pandemic novel for, I guess, about 3 years. And he's done all this research about historical pandemics. And looking at how, and so this piece is about, this piece in the Times that he wrote is about the ways in which actually this is not unprecedented. The ways in which the way that we react socially to a pandemic is actually, it happens over and over and over and over again. And so I think historical contextualization is really important, both for a sense that like we can get through this because we have before, but also for potentially changing patterns of behavior. One of the things he points out is that we often react to pandemics as with xenophobia, right? And so this and denial and xenophobia tend to be the immediate reactions to a pandemic. And so how can we disrupt those initial reactions, knowing that this is sort of how the human species has sort of reacted across the world, across time to these sorts of situations. So I think that's another way that another role that the humanities and the social sciences can play. I do think that sometimes we are so trained to recognize systems and so trained to theorize power that we can lose track a little bit of the fact that there are individuals, and I think it is really important to, remain connected to the human side of things, and to not detach too much. I think it's important. Detachment serves a purpose, but I think it's also, it's important to be able to recognize this not only as a systemic crisis, not only as, but also as an affective crisis, one of emotion, as Katina was saying. Yep.
So I can mention very quickly our effort with my colleague, another FI fellow, Sichi2. We started writing a blog post series, which I'm linking in the chat, in which we reflect on our collective human heritage. I'm thinking about disease and medicine and race. And she's a sociologist and I'm an anthropologist. but we try to read widely across the disciplines, and we wanted to begin to translate some of what we know has been written about the history of pandemics, but also the relationship between biology and race and society and race. And with her expertise on China and Asia, really valuable knowledge as somebody, as she had really been following the pandemic before it was a pandemic, but an epidemic, right? And yeah, so I'll just stop that there and link that here. And it's sort of beginning an invitation to try to think about how we can do public science, how we can do public humanities, and how we can communicate our collective human heritage to everyone. So.
Is there anything else anyone would like to add before I move on to our next question? Stacy, Katina, Cihan?
I was also just going to say, I read a piece by Alondra Nelson for SSRC the other day called Society After Pandemic that reflects a lot of what everyone has been saying. And I just wanted to read two quick quotes from that. One is that she says, the pandemic has confirmed what scholars have known about social inequality and compounded the intersecting forces of race, class, and gender on disparate life chances. And she also says, how do the social conditions exposed, exacerbated, and created by the novel coronavirus demand that we substantively rethink our ideas of society? And I think that's a really important piece of it too, that we're at a moment where things are very destabilized, which creates opportunities for change. And I think that we really need deeply trained humanities and social science scholars to aid in that recreation and that transition if we want to emerge from this with systems that protect people better than before. And maybe that's wishful thinking to hope that that can come to pass, but I certainly want people with those backgrounds to be a part of these conversations and to be shaping some of the new dynamics and structures that come about after.
Awesome. So I'm going to move us on to our next question. I'm going to copy and paste it into the chat as well. So how can we foster greater equity and inclusion and also more creative and potentially public scholarship by breaking down some of the tacit expectations that currently exist in graduate education? So
Stacey,
maybe,
do you want to start on this?
Stacey, you want to start us off?
Oh, sure. So I think that I think that it requires us to acknowledge the ways in which, the same, as we've been talking about, the same structures that are at work outside of graduate education are also at work within graduate education, and that opportunities are unevenly distributed. This is certainly, and that this is exacerbated by things like the prestige economy in higher ed. And I think this is going to become even more critical as we look towards the future. I've been sort of thinking about, I think there's going to be a lot of changes that come out of this. I think that everybody is in agreement that the world after the pandemic, both within higher ed, but also outside of higher ed, is not going to look the same. And I think it's really easy, it's easier to imagine sort of negative changes that come out of it, because because in some ways, you already had inequalities that were being exacerbated by, that we already had inequalities that had been exacerbated, and it's tempting to, it's easy to imagine those getting worse in the post-pandemic world where resources are perhaps scarcer. I think it's harder in some ways to imagine the potential of such a world, but I think it's really important to imagine the potential of such a world, as Katina just mentioned, because the only way we're able to push back against some of the changes, the negative changes that exacerbate inequalities, that would increase precarity, that would diminish the resources that are available to us as educators, the only way to push back against that is to imagine where we want to be. And so I think this is a moment for like a lot of imagination when it comes to thinking about equity and inclusion and like who we could be as scholars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot. This is maybe a much more like a narrower vision than what Stacy just talked about, but I've been thinking a lot about the role of admissions in graduate education and the role that plays in equity and inclusion, and also in like the broader question of what we consider to be scholarly success. And I think that these two questions are really deeply intertwined. If you think about, if you've ever served on a graduate committee, admissions committee, or have gone through the process as an applicant, you know that the committee is looking for people, they want people who will succeed. You know, they want to select people who can thrive within the system, who can make it successfully through their program, and you know, emerge and find a career that suits them well, and do good work from there, which is good. But the vision of what that success looks like, I think, is very narrow. And so the types of criteria that admissions committees are often looking for reward a certain type of student, which is you know, someone with high test scores, someone who knows how to navigate the kind of the hidden languages of applications and of administrative systems. And it's, you know, it tends to be people who are from families that are wealthier, families that are white, families that are more educated. And so when we're looking for these same types of success that rely on these same systems of evaluation and metrics, then we select for students who can move within that world already. And I think that, you know, then what we often see is institutions are trying to increase their diversity. They're trying to bring in students of color, they're trying to bring in faculty of color, but they do not have systems set up to actually support those students and those faculty. They don't necessarily have the social supports needed for mentorship. They don't necessarily have the financial supports needed for someone who's a first-generation student, or who doesn't have family who can support them through their education. They don't necessarily have support for someone who's navigating, you know, countless microaggressions in the course of a day, and doesn't have someone who they can turn to navigate that process while also succeeding in their scholarly work. And at the same time, I think that, you know, as long as the types of evaluative materials that we're looking for things like tenure and promotion are things like peer-reviewed articles in scholarly journals without necessarily having a broader and more capacious understanding of the work that scholarship can do in the world, then it's much harder for people to make the case that their scholarship, if it's embedded within community work, if it's embedded in something that serves the public good, it's often, that work is often something that has to be done in addition to the monograph or the articles. And so I think that, you know, rethinking what is considered to be successful scholarship, what is meaningful scholarship, what are the products that we're looking for that we can evaluate, or how can we better evaluate processes instead of products? I think that all of those questions sound really abstract, but they're also really deeply connected to just who are we recruiting as incoming students, what kind of students do we think can thrive within our systems, and how can we enable a broader range of students to thrive?
Can I just add, you know, I think it's one of the things that I have observed is that when situations become precarious, and I think we've all been in a situation of precarity in higher ed and for a long time now, and I think we're all feeling that very acutely, and even people who did not feel it acutely before are now feeling it. In situations of precarity, we have some of us, many people have the tendency to sort of hunker down, and I call it turtling. Because you imagine a turtle sort of pulling all its limbs into a shell and like just trying to like keep itself safe. And I think that perpetuates things like admissions practices, right? It perpetuates admissions practices. It perpetuates tenure and promotion practices. It perpetuates all of these systems that contribute to inequities in higher ed. And so I think one of the challenges that we all have is to resist the urge to turtle, right? And to push those around us also and say, actually, this isn't the time to double down on what we've been doing. This is the time to look outside of what we've been doing and say, what else could we do? You know, and I think it's more important than ever, especially in graduate education, with the way that the academic job market might be for the next few years. We all need to be looking ahead and say, how are we preparing our students for a variety of possibilities? All of our students, but especially people who might not have the same opportunities and privileges as others.
Yeah, just to, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, going to say to illustrate some of the points on graduate admissions, that kind of just got me thinking about structures of admissions committees, requirements for, GRE exams, and sort of how some of those processes sort of favor certain types of applicants over others. And it also got me thinking about the funding models and differing funding models at different institutions. And I think one particular way that can foster greater inclusion and equity across the board is funding, and what that looks like for applicants. So that's just something that I kind of thought of.
So I'm gonna move on to our last question, and then we're gonna open up for a wider discussion and Q&A. So my last question for the team, I was gonna call it panelists, I guess we are. What is the relationship between career diversity and academic labor issues, like the adjunct crisis? Where do they connect? How can we work toward reform on both fronts simultaneously? Oh, sorry, I am pasting it in the chat. So what is the relationship between career diversity and academic labor? Where do they connect? And how can we work toward reform on both fronts simultaneously? So we have actually about 5 minutes left before we open it up to the audience more.
So I am really strongly convinced that these two issues are very deeply connected. I think that a lot of what we're seeing in career diversity conversations is connected to the fact that teaching is devalued. And there's, it's a little bit hard to talk about, because I think sometimes when I talk about career diversity or just applications of humanities education in other spaces, sometimes people think that I am trying to draw people away from the profession of teaching and learning, and that's not at all the case. I actually think that because of what Stacy was saying earlier, where you have the research product that's so highly valued in a capitalist economy, and the processes of teaching and mentorship and service that are generally, depends a little bit on the institution, but they're generally much less highly valued than the research outcomes are. And I think that it's that devaluation of teaching. It's the difficulty that we have in evaluating what successful teaching looks like. It's the difficulty that we have in understanding, what kinds of scholarly craft are involved in knowing how to take something that's really deeply specialized and complex and present it to students in a way that's meaningful and that brings them along in their education. That process is not altogether different from the process of public engagement. And I think that if we had a deeper respect and appreciation for the real scholarly and intellectual work that happens in teaching spaces, I think that we would also find it easier to talk about why public engagement matters. I'm not convinced that we actually value teaching as, as like, if I can speak about higher ed as the broader we, I'm not convinced that teaching is as important as it should be within higher ed spaces. And so I think that that's why we see institutions relying more on adjunct labor. It's because that teaching is not, this is aside from all of the budgetary issues, which are real. I mean, we're at CUNY, we know that funding crises are constant, and we need to advocate for public reinvestment in higher education at the same time. But along with that reinvestment, has to come an investment in the process of teaching.
I'm gonna ask you to wrap up, Katina, since
Thank
we
you. Sorry.
have a couple of minutes left, and maybe Stacy and Justin want to say something as well before we open it up.
Stacy?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Katina was.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes. Sorry. So yeah, I completely agree, and I think this has to do. Whenever I hear about this, I think about the fact that as a profession, the humanities in particular have resisted the creation of full-time teaching positions, mostly, except in languages and except in writing centers. And I think that goes back to wanting to protect tenure, but it has resulted in two very extreme forms of academic labor, one of which is very precarious and one of which is very permanent. And I think really one of the things that I would like to be far more under discussion is like, what would it mean to have full-time teaching roles? Because there are a number of people who actually don't really, it is not true that everybody who is adjuncting wants a tenure track position at a Research One university. That is simply not true. People have, many people really want to teach. They really don't necessarily want to do, they either don't want to do research or they don't want to do research, the type of research that they would need to do to get tenure somewhere. And so I do think that, you know, when we redefine success for graduate students, one thing that we allow people to do is to think expansively about careers both inside and outside the academy. But we also allow ourselves to redefine. So we allow people to think expansively about careers outside the academy, but we also would allow ourselves to think more expansively about careers inside the academy, and not to perhaps not to overvalue the research product, right, as much as we do, but to value more the labor of teaching, right? And I think that this is a conversation that we really need to have as a profession. And you know, and I understand the concerns about tenure. I will just say that I think in protecting tenure, we've made a lot of decisions that have been detrimental to people who don't have tenure, and we need to really be clear about that. And we need to be clear about what the cost of protecting tenure as an institution has done. So this is my provocative remark. But this is, you know, I do think that there have been costs to protecting tenure, and we need to address some of those.
Yeah, and the last point I'll just throw in there is sort of the role of collective bargaining and how that might impact particularly adjunct faculty, but the role of tenured faculty in advocating for the full faculty, including adjunct folks. I know CUNY's in a bit of a different position with everyone being a part of the PSC, but a lot of institutions don't have that model, and they either have separate collective bargaining units or there is not one for adjunct faculty. So sort of the role of unionization and maybe addressing some of the diversity and labor issues.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we can criticize many things in the CUNY system, the workload, reliance on adjuncts, but as a graduate assistant, it's amazing to have health insurance and basic labor protections and a union representative, and not actually have to fight for these things when we think about our colleagues who are graduate assistants in very wealthy private institutions who are facing union busting just because they want basic workers' rights.
Right, and just to clarify too, that generally applies to those who have graduate assistantships. So those in CUNY who are tuition-only fellows like myself are not a part of the PSC, and so how that might impact students in my situation as well.
Very good point. With that, I'm gonna open it up. We already have some questions from the chat. I don't know if those people who, we've been keeping track of them, but maybe let us know if you want to be unmuted now so you can provide questions or comments or add to the discussion. You know, Grace Afsari Mamagani, I'd be interested to hear more about how we have conversations about community college and even K-12 teaching in ways that don't frame them as fallbacks.
This is such a good question. I am not as well versed in K-12 teaching, but I can say that as far as community college teaching goes, this is something that the Futures Initiative and others at the Grad Center have been working on over the last few years, primarily through the Humanities Alliance program. The Humanities Alliance is a Mellon-funded program. We're so grateful to Mellon for the opportunity to explore this, that connects graduate training on one hand with community college teaching. And I think that those are two parts of the higher education landscape that are not often connected. And so this was a way for graduate students to explore through a well-funded, at least by CUNY standards, a well-funded fellowship with many resources around like teaching structures, student engagement, student-centered learning, and what it looks like to teach CUNY students in their particular circumstances and their particular life circumstances and what they're bringing into the classroom. as resources and as challenges every day. And I think that Mellon's involvement in community college funding has been really important, because I think that given that we do work within a prestige economy, having an elite funder like Mellon say that this is something that matters is something that has changed the conversation over the last few years, at least in what I've seen. I think that, you know, what I see at CUNY is graduate students who have a really deep commitment to teaching, to working with students, to serving the city in some way that's meaningful for them. And yet that desire is not always heard and met with guidance that leads them into the kinds of roles that where that work could be done. And I think that, you know, community college teaching is not, there's not one solution to the jobs crisis right now. Community colleges cannot employ everybody either. There's a challenge in hiring and in funding everywhere within higher ed right now. But I think that there are, I think that the points of connection have to come before someone's looking for a job. And I think that's true for community college teaching and for many other types of careers, that if someone is hearing for the first time about this job possibility when they're looking for a job, then it feels like a fallback. But if they're hearing about it from day one, it feels very different. So those are some things that I would point to. I'll drop a link to
great.
I can also, oh, sorry, go ahead, Cihan.
Sorry, the Grace is now unmuted. She raised her hand before, but if you want to add something, Stacy, go ahead.
I was going to say something about K-12. So I actually had a great conversation earlier this week with somebody who runs or who is running trying to get a sort of an experimental middle school and high school off the ground in DC that would make use of DC's museums and public spaces in the curriculum. And I was put in touch with this person by one of my fellows who has a background in K-12 education and curriculum design. And, you know, through the course of this conversation, she and I, it became clear how similar some of the issues are, all the way from elementary school up through higher, up through not just, you know, undergraduate, but into graduate school, right? And the fact that we're all trying to think about education in a more public way. And I think it's not limited to higher ed. It's also a situation at other levels of education. And I think, you know, I would never have met this person if I did not have a fellow who had a K-12 background, and if I did not know about that fellow's K-12 background. And if that person was not also, like, in this moment still pursuing opportunities in that arena. And so I think one of the issues is, you know, admitting people, not only admitting people who have K-12 teaching backgrounds into graduate programs, but then valuing that experience and encouraging them to remain connected to that world in some way. And that allows a flow of information and ideas and resources back and forth that I think is really critical to building relationships between higher ed and K-12, and building pipelines of students who are really interested in those jobs, not as a fallback, but as something that they really want to do.
Yeah, and also, hi guys, thank you so much for hosting this, because certainly I was feeling the sadness of not having this event in person. But this to me is related, I think, to a adjacent question of, well, what does it mean to potentially bring folks from other sectors or industries, even the private sector, back in to teach in the academy, right? Because we so devalue adjunct labor that there isn't necessarily, we don't really see in the humanities the kind of model that we get at design schools or other kinds of schools, right? Where you have folks who are maybe K through 12 educators or educational technologists who are actually teaching courses in the humanities or, you know, in humanities adjacent fields. And that is also really, I think, circumscribes what students think is possible in terms of career diversity, because they don't see those people teaching their courses, right? It's like predominantly tenured track faculty. So just something too, I thought we could think about.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that was the original model for adjunct teaching, was that they were professors of the practice, and that does persist in some fields, but not in many. And I think that I think you're exactly right that it's very different to have someone who's teaching a course as an adjunct alongside another career than someone who's, you know, cobbling together 5 classes at 5 different institutions with no health insurance. It's just fundamentally a different approach to the classroom. And I think that I think it's a great thing to think about. I think that there's so many labor structures that have to be reevaluated to get there, that it feels far off.
So we have another question. It's a follow-up question. Dylan says, I'd be curious to hear more from Katina and the other panelists about how the devaluation of teaching creates barriers to public engagement. I'm also wondering if you think that re-evaluating service, arguably the part of the service/teaching/research triad that most closely resembles public engagement, would help orient scholars towards public-facing work.
Yes, I think it would. And I have such sadness that service is so devalued. I think that thoughtful service work, thoughtful mentorship, thoughtful administrative work is so important. I mean, there's such a difference between programs that are run by people who really care, who understand the systems, who understand how to navigate them, who care about their students and take time to talk with them. It is hard work, it's often invisible work, and it is very much not work that is often valued. I think that a lot of that has to do with gender bias and the proximity of that work to care work. I sometimes reframe service work as leadership work for like career marketing purposes, which I think makes it more legible in that context, but I wish that the care work itself were valued. And as for teaching, I mean, I think that maybe others can speak to this too, but I think I've been thinking especially about like intro classes and the work of presenting complicated ideas for a new audience. And even though a class is not an audience, they're working through ideas with you as the teacher. But what you often hear about public engagement work is that it's dumbing down the scholarship. And I think that that to me reflects a lack of appreciation for the work of teaching. You're not dumbing something down if you're bringing someone alongside you to understand something. So that's the point of connection that I make, that I'd be curious to hear from others.
Well, at a very, sorry, Cihan, would you like?
Maybe you can combine your answer, Stacy. I'm also going to point out this question that we have from the audience. Is there a value to prestige that we would like to hold on to as we build new structures that are less beholden to it, less enthralled to it?
So I was going to say, I'll see if I can combine my answers. I'm going to be doing this on the fly, so who knows? So I was going to say that at like a very basic level, I think it's an issue. It's an issue for the relationship between the university and the public, that the thing that the public most values from us, which is teaching and educating. I don't want to say just young people, because there's many people of different ages, especially in the CUNY system, who are there as students. But the public values our role as educators, and very often what inside the academy, what is valued is research, which is neither understood nor really, and sometimes not valued outside of it. And so I think that disconnect is a barrier to public engagement. And I think we need to take seriously the fact that for many people, the role that we serve is about teaching. I don't know that I have an answer to whether there's something. I've become so mad at the prestige economy. Like I have like this visceral reaction to words like rigor, like a physical allergic reaction. I don't know that I that's an interesting question. I think that was Rachel's question, and that's an interesting question, but not one that I know that I myself can answer.
Rachel, do you have any, oh, sorry, go ahead, Justin.
No, go ahead, Katina.
Well, only because I know Rachel and I saw that it was her question. Rachel, do you have any thoughts that you would want to share about that? It's a really good question and one that I think is difficult to answer. Not to put you on the spot.
I'm just going to stay on audio since it's lunchtime on the West Coast over here. So yeah, I wonder if it indicates something about exclusion, but also about excellence, and that we might want to hold on to the latter. And this is something I've been struggling with a lot in thinking about the prestige economy. Because when you put it in those terms, it's always going to be a system of reward and kind of currency, right? I even read in Inside Higher Ed this morning, as many of you might have, a kind of interview with a person who just wrote a book about succeeding on the academic job market and was highly tilted toward research output and really, really highly tilted against service, like very explicitly. And we know that that's has so many implications for people's identities, commitments, and communities. So I was really troubled by that, but I wasn't surprised by it. But I just wonder if we could see something along the lines of excellence in service, excellence in teaching, and keep those things and as having prestige, right? How can we reassign prestige rather than just try to banish it in the ways that it can indicate excellence, rather than just trying to sort people out in all the problematic ways that so many of you have pointed out so thoughtfully. So that's kind of where my mind is with it right now, but that's as much as I've formulated, so.
Rachel,
Yeah.
I love that point about excellence, because I think that makes me think sort of about the, at least public perception, but even within institutional perception of sort of this ivory tower idea of what prestige and exclusion and excellence mean to some folks versus what it means to others. And I wonder if there's a way we can focus on excellence as, you know, doing our work with, you know, sound methods, strong ethical and moral foundations, in a way that works with the public and together with the public, because we ourselves are also the public. We are not just separate from everybody else because we say we are as part of the academy. And so that's something that I think about too, because the knowledge that gets created shouldn't just be distributed amongst those within the academy. It should be shared broadly. I personally do believe in the value of public scholarship and what that provides to our communities. And it should be done in conjunction with the communities that we are all a part of, or the publics that we are all a part of, because that exclusionary approach is possibly, you know, I have not done research on it, but is possibly what contributes to some public perceptions about, you know, negative thoughts and feelings towards folks who work in academia of, oh, there they are just in their ivory tower doing what they do, thinking they're better than other people. And I think some of that is based in reality for some folks. It's not a reality for other folks, but it does come from somewhere. And so how we can open up the academy more and focusing on excellence in a different way, I think is crucial.
For myself, I also don't see how we can expect people to continue funding our research. I care very much about being a researcher and research done in the university, especially in public institutions, but how can we expect people to support it when people don't have access to basic science education? Just witnessing, for me, also someone who's not from this country, coming from somewhere with mandatory vaccines, just the value of vaccines being questioned and like a basic misunderstanding of how they work, for me is a basic indicator that we are not doing a good job communicating what the universities are doing, what science is doing, and what research is doing, even in what I would have previously considered like very concrete benefits, like the lack of disease, right? So yeah, just my 2 cents. And having said that, we have about 6 minutes, and we had planned to do some synthesis during this time, but I'm gonna leave it up to you, Katina, to see if you wanna do a synthesis or continue taking some comments or questions from the audience.
Oh man, we knew that an hour would feel short, and it feels so short, and I see so many good questions and so many people that I want to hear from, and it is kind of crushing to not be able to just be in a room together. I'm also thinking about the question that someone raised about how we actually value things differently, and I think, you know, some of it starts with paying people properly, giving people health insurance. I think we see this in K-12 too, like I think teaching in particular gets cast as a kind of a vocational model where you have to love what you do. And that rhetoric of love covers a lot of improper labor practices. So I think seeing our work as work is a really important starting point. I think, you know, there are lots of places that are doing good work in this area. I added a link to Humetrics in the chat, which is thinking about different ways of ascribing value to the work that humanities scholars and social science scholars are doing. There's so many different really excellent projects that are happening all over the country, both in public institutions and in private institutions. And we've gathered some resources together on the public notes document, and my book shares a lot of these as well. And I think, you know, we also, this was something that I wanted to say earlier, I really don't want to dismiss all of that excellent work that is being done. People have been working really hard on these questions for decades. And I think it's a sticky question. The questions of prestige and values, they're not things that, that loosen easily. They're very deeply felt and very deeply held and deeply worked into the structures within which we work. But all of these structures have been created at some point, and they can be changed. And I think that what we're seeing right now in the pandemic is, you know, we had been told for how long that courses had to meet in a certain way, or that work had to be done in a certain way, and overnight that changed. And I think that the type of distance learning that we're doing in this moment is not ideal. It's not the kind of distance learning that, you know, organizations like HASTAC have been talking thoughtfully about in terms of pedagogical engagement for years. It's emergency learning, and it's crisis management learning, but they changed. Things changed rapidly, and so that's the thing that's bringing me some hope right now. And as we wrap up, something that I would love to hear from each person is maybe something that is bringing you hope in this moment, either an example of good work, something that you think, you know, glimmers of change that you see at this moment, or things that make you feel like, you know, like there's something that could be on the horizon. So
I will say that I am hopeful. You know, I think, you know, the last crisis the last sort of economic crisis in 2008, I think we didn't have as many people in positions to really push for change. Like, the academy was unprepared, and we're still unprepared. But I think that there are people who really want to make change and are in a position to do it, and to push people who are higher up in administrations to really think about students. And really think about the long-term well-being of their students as they make changes. And I see that happening. I'm in conversation with a lot of people in graduate education, in the graduate education field across the country. And I see people really fighting for their students. And I think that's really, that has given me a lot of hope, that we're at a moment, sort of like Katina said, where the status quo kind of doesn't exist right now. So what is possible when the status quo doesn't exist? And I think that there are a lot of really great people who are positioned to push for change right now, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Just briefly, for me, I think that maybe we will be losing some stuff and people and structures that we were invested in, but we will, I hope, also be losing some harmful structures and harmful ways of operating as a result of this, and focus on what's important. So, and also just knowing that the world has been through better and worse moments, and yeah, there will be a way. And I'm sorry, Justin, go ahead, and then I will say a final sentence to wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah, the only thing I'd want to add to all of this is that hopefully there's sort of a renewed emphasis on people. I've seen a huge increase, at least in circles I've been a part of people staying in touch and communicating with one another. And so I'm hopeful that creates new avenues for collaboration, for stronger communication, and more collective action and advocacy for a better future, not just for higher education, but in general. So trying to stay hopeful on that front.
So I'm very sorry if we didn't get to your excellent questions. Maybe we can answer them in the coming conversations, whether they're in writing or in person or at the conference next year, and possibly in events like this in between now and then. And thank you so much for joining us. And we are at the end of our allotted time. So thank you for coming.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
It's such a pleasure. I dropped this into the chat, but please feel free to continue adding comments and questions on the Google Doc and on Twitter using Fight for EDU. I think this is a conversation that can continue, and it's been such a delight to be here with you all today. Thanks, and I hope everyone continues to stay healthy and takes good care.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.